So for Ruby Watson, first of all, I want to give you some background about the circumstances under which she had the opportunity to observe and interview and found out about practices in Hong Kong. After 1945 or 49, it becomes impossible for international scholars to conduct their research in mainland China because the Red China, the Communist China, was completely sealed off, closed from fieldwork, from collaboration, scholarly observation for people outside of mainland China. So for people like Professor Ruby Watson and her husband partner James Watson, also an anthropologist, they could have two choices. They could come to Hong Kong and do their work and study about China or one aspect of China, or they could go to Taiwan, and some of them did, to study the Hakka in Meinong and Kaohsiung, or Shulin, like others have done, and taking that to be part of the Chinese population, quote, namely Han Chinese populations. So this is how Ruby Watson presented the paper, which eventually got included in a conference volume. Ruby, examined the statuses of wives, concubines, and little maids in the Hong Kong region from 1900 to 1940 from the households. The households tend to be very large households. Large households including wives, concubines, slaves, indentured servants, because 3 or 4 generations of families lived in the new territory, traditional families, households, mostly agricultural and working from the land. They were not urban, they were not fashionable, and I think after this lecture, you could think about whether or when they entered into the modern era. For women, they entered a household through marriage, as I told you. Marriage is the ladder of success. Whether it's success or not, it's the ladder. Women could be born into a household or married into a household. Wives came through marriage. Other women arrived through various routing involving the market, that is the selling of people. This is what Ruby Watson also wanted to talk with us about the Hong Kong in the 20th century if you want to talk about marriage and sexuality. So within a single household, relations between employer and employees, master and servants, owner and owned, debtor and lender, these all forces can come to bear on marriages and sexuality. Ruby, also quoted other scholars who studied Chinese women, such as Professor Hill Gates, then from Yale, who in articles of 1989 reminded people of a general kind of social cultural invisibility of Chinese women, because you could only see women's lives through man. This we had giving the lecture about the male gaze or in mutual gaze. That is, conventionally for the mainstream, before they married, women were under the command of their fathers, after they got married, they depend on their husbands. And if they outlived the husbands, they might fall under the authority of their sons, certainly judicially. So the kingship status could be ambiguous. Marjorie Wolf, studying women in Taiwan, together with Arthur Wolf and her husband, Marjorie pointed out that women could be only temporary sojourners in their father's households. Even after marriage, they could be integrated into the husband's family, but to her, that's a partial integration. She eventually would develop what Professor Wolf called a family, a utero family, that she gave birth to. Those sons and daughters would be a mother's lineage. So for Hong Kong, Ruby Watson was surprised to find that in addition to wife, there were other types of household women, especially two kinds that she wants to introduce. One is the qie, concubines. The other were the little maids, mui zai, in Cantonese. These two categories to her are very difficult to categorize, and yet they were very prevalent. You see them in Hong Kong households then, so that's 100 years before now, among Hong Kong households. These to her signified, represented unfree population, because they could assume a semi-king role, that they live within the household or family, but they're different. First of all, they were different from wives or mothers or grandmothers, and they were also different from each other, that is, whether concubines or little maids. The maids fell more easily to her within the category of servants, but they were not free to go or to do whatever they wish. To people who come from the West, that's shocking, and so she wanted to study more. These people, both concubines and little maids, Wei Zhai, that participated fully in the life of family. But both groups of women shared a marginal status. They were marginal because they were not giving a proper status like wife or other women, mothers, grandmothers, sisters. Wives and daughters were the proper women relating to the household or family. They take care of the household's needs, including in ritual times, ceremonies related to ancestors and deities. But concubines and maids, to mention one example, they have no such responsibility nor such right to get close to family rituals. So when daughters left the household of a family, the wives entered the household. A wife entered with ceremony, wedding ceremonies. These ceremonies, though tedious, maybe pleasant or not, but they were important because they gave proper role to the women, to the wives. But for concubines, qie, who entered or eventually leave a family, they come and go without ceremonies, unacknowledged. The little maids and other menial workers were even less. There were no ritual recognition. Wives, therefore, could have a claim on people's attention after life. Women of lesser status had none. What Ruby would want to remind us is that there existed a market in the movement of population for women in Hong Kong then, in a new territory that she did her fieldwork. Namely, in late imperial and republican periods, for domestic servants and industrial workers, they could live under coerced labor by ties of debt bondage. They were involuntarily endangered. So Emily Honeck, Gail Hershatter, James Watson all documented that. It is very important for her to learn and to report to others how Mui Zai and concubines within this context really relate to the marriage and sexuality in the market of population. According to James Watson, until 1949 in Hong Kong's new territory, male servants, 戏门, they inherited their status through the male line. They were attached to wealthy households or even not so wealthy households. Their emancipation at the time of Republican Revolution would free male slavery to a institution in the region. Pawning and indenture continued to be part of the labor scene after World War II. So for women, they were represented or perhaps overrepresented among Hong Kong's unfree population. They gave examples such as in 1879, Sir John Smell, Supreme Court Justice, noted the kidnapping and selling of children in Hong Kong. That there, to them, were two forms of slavery, which continue to exist in the colony, Hong Kong colony. One was the domestic servitude, which is related to Mui Zai's circumstances. The other was women being sold into the market of Brussels for prostitution. Andrew Sankar, anthropologist in Hong Kong who studied domestic servants, also pointed out that in the early 1900s, Mui Zai constituted the majority of non-family labor in local households. These evidence continue to be presented to the paper that Ruby Watson suggests, whereby concubines and Mui Zai were present in substantial numbers until after World War II. So Mui Zai, although most oftenly found in the household of urban middle and middle classes, they also exist in the rural countryside of Hong Kong. Because rural shopkeepers and rich peasants, they could afford, and they did, avail themselves of Mui Zai labor. In Hong Kong's hinterland, which includes Ha Shui, this is the Xia Shui, that Ruby Watson conducted her anthropological research in 1977 and 78. And adult women she interviewed or observed include the patterns of marriage and sexuality for the first half of the 20th century. So Ruby Watson reported saying that she was told that Mui Zai could be found in many village households before and after World War II. There was no published, that is documented, estimates of the number of Mui Zai living in Hong Kong villages then. But they were certainly considered by their contemporary Hong Kongers to be a normal part of the household picture of the rich. So James Watson, Ruby Watson continued to write about those. According to the Ha Sui residents, Mui Zai worked as household servants in the village until well after 51, when the last little maids left the master's house, become a concubine of childless peasant. Because like Mui Zai, these Qie, concubines, they were also found in households of better off. Their functions or their roles were different from Mui Zai or from each other. Chinese concubines were recognized as sexual partners to the male masters who lived in the household, who gave birth to children, offsprings. These were legitimate children because legally Chinese men could have one wife, that's the qi, zheng qi, right? But a concubine with a lower social status than qi existed. In contrast to wives, concubines were not endowed with property when they entered into the household. The families received no betrothal gifts. That is, her family received no pinli from the man, and the concubines themselves were sent off with no dowries. So you see, transaction of money or monetary commodities were important, at least to Ruby Watson's understanding. Perpetuating the male line was the reason for taking a concubine, usually. I think in Tangzhen I lectured about that too. But this could be ignored by others. The general description of concubinage could be viewed in Professor Jack Goody of Cambridge study. Concubines continue to have a legal status well after the 1911 revolution on the Chinese mainland as well as Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, they enjoyed legal protection until 1971. That's when Hong Kong law finally forbidden polygamy, that is, multiple marriage relations. So you could see still in Hong Kong today, people who have concubines or Mui Zai, if they got married in 71, a good 60 years later, these men and women in their 80s could still be around with their unions, that is, marriage or sexual relations, continue to be recognized along with their children. Data from Hong Kong Hakka villages in rural area about sericulture, that is silk industry, of Pearl River Delta suggested that economic status was an important factor in concubinage. But wealth is not the only factor that explained the prevalence, the widespread of concubinage in the Hong Kong region. Elizabeth Johnson, John Pratt, found concubines living in poor Hong Kong community they studied in Shunde County 2, northwest of Hong Kong. Marjorie Tropley discovered that concubinage appeared to be very widespread among tenant farmers, as well as landowners. That's in part because their labors were needed and their sexuality and company service were taken advantage of. So, how did people acquire wives, concubines, and maids? In terms of three modes of acquisition, Professor Ruby Watson wanted to say that wives, concubines, and maids enter into a household marked by a different modes of transfer of money. The way people thought about and discussed about these transfers also differed significantly. The language of exchange of gifts and reciprocal relations was used for wives. That is, man's wife would 下聘, pay, for the bride's money as gifts, and the bride's family would prepare 嫁妆, dowries to send her off. Those were languages and terms that suggested some sort of marketplace was there for wives, but certainly much more directly so for concubines and maids. Because in marrying a wife, gifts, money were exchanged. Sometimes one-sided, the groom's family to the grooms, but the bride's family always would prepare some return to the groom's side. So better off family, wealthier families, gave substantial dowries to the daughter that got married off. Dandelion, Pat Ebury, and Ruby Watson published about these dowry and bride gifts. But even among the poor, the bride, that is wives, would not enter the husband's house empty-handed, and especially they entered with a formal wedding. The wedding is very important. The concubine, on the other hand, she entered into her master's household quietly without any ceremony. She could be joined, from traveling from her own house to the new household by a chair, that is sedan chair. This is 轿子. Only 妾 could use that. Wife would enter with a 花轿, a sedan chair. Concubines would not be carried in with a wedding. So 买 is what's used, a term. Purchase, buying was a term used to describe the process of how a concubine was acquired in Hong Kong in the first half of the 20th century. In most cases, she was purchased for life. In these circumstances, the only ceremony that a concubine performing to enter the master's household was a serving of tea to the wife. See, the wife, when in the wedding, engaged, would serve tea to the parents-in-law. But 妾 would serve tea to the wife, which meant the wife, 妻, would listen to the parents-in-law and the husband, but the 妾 would listen to the wife. After which the concubine assumed a recognized place in the new environment, especially when children were born to her. Then she would live in her master's house and accepted as legitimate. According to Qing legal code, and later 民法亲属篇, the Republican Chinese law code accepted that as the mother of children born to concubines, the concubines had similar rights as wife, but not the same status, as 同居人, cohabitants of the family and the man. Little maids, on the other hand, they were also purchased, but their circumstances were even more deplorable, usually, because unlike concubines who served for life, maids, 女宰, at least in Hong Kong region, were expected to serve only a limited period, usually until age 18 or so, at which time they could be married off by their masters, and they ceased to be servants. But this part of the bargain had been fulfilled to the first master because their time of service was seen as limited by the obligation of the master to have to marry them off, although they tend not to marry off well. 女宰 more like indentured servants, like slaves. They could be married off by their masters, but for all practical purposes, 女宰 was treated as if they belonged to her master. So both wife and concubines, in a way, were brought into the household as sexual partners, speaking of sexuality. They produce heirs, children, if they could. Wives expected to manage domestic chores. Concubines were controlled and managed themselves as family property. Legally, a concubine's children share the same status, or similarly to children of the prince of the wife, but of course people know that they're different. They were treated different, they have different self-image and social roles. So it's not unknown for concubine's children to suffer discrimination and banishment, either by their father or especially after their father passed away from their half-brothers and other kingmen households. So concubines were themselves not considered as family king. Their children could be accepted as family members. They have social fathers and social mothers. That is, the wives was their formal mother, not their natural mother. Concubines were not acknowledged as the mothers of their own children. The children of a concubine born into a family within their father's household, their father's wife, become their mother. They acknowledge them as the formal mother. And the concubine could be called auntie, or could be called, even though the concubine gave birth to these children, the children would not receive them as formal mother. That's the convention. The 女宰, the maidservants, they were clearly servants. In terms of sexuality, the masters of the household, oftentimes had sexual relations with 女宰. If children were born of such relationships, it was left to the man, namely the father of these children, to decide whether they would accept or reject this, to recognize these children's status. So that was the situation in Roman too. In European history, legitimacy was often defined by marriage and often single-handedly decided by fathers. That was sanctioned by church. In China, for the Chinese population, they might not be Christians, and therefore church might not be involved. The father could legitimate his children by recognizing them publicly in the 满月, the naming ritual at the 1 month after birth, or in lineage community rituals, and to celebrate the birth of sons. So in conclusion, Professor Ruby Watson would like to say, wives, concubines, maids, they're all different in terms of their marriages or sexual relations to households, masters. They entered into the household by different modes, that is, incorporated into the household with some sort of exchange of gifts, ceremony, or without ceremonies. Concubines and maids could be sold directly and therefore enter the household with no link to the outside world. There was no personal freedom to be spoken of or defended. Concubine, 妾, and 妹仔 share a number of characteristics to Ruby Watson. That is, in some important aspects, concubines served the house for life. Usually can be less capable than 妹仔 because their main duty was to produce children and listen to or help the wives. 妹仔 could achieve emancipation if they married well, although most of them exchange one servile situation to another because they usually could become a concubine or worse, sold off. So with this, actually, I would like to mention one thing. Surely marriage and sexuality in Hong Kong did not end in the 1970s. It is important in a course about marriage and sexuality in the modern world to realize one thing. That is, marriage and sexuality nowadays in Hong Kong or China need not to be one and the same thing. Now we oftentimes would say that there is a Sinophone world. That is, people use different kinds of Chinese language. This include mainland China, include Hong Kong, Taiwan, include overseas Chinese. As people enter into the world of post-World War II, especially approaching the end of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st century, marriage is one thing. People's sexual activities often becomes another. People could have gratifications from sexual activities outside of marriage. And this, of course, could be discussed in a separate occasion.